Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Cross, and I will be reviewing Chapter 8 of our textbook. And Chapter 8 is covering evaluation, termination, and follow up in generalist practice. This recording will serve as a brief overview of the chapter. Please make sure that you read the full chapter in its entirety. The objectives for this chapter is to identify and use appropriate methods for evaluating practice, critically analyze concepts important to evaluation of practice, identify commonly used methods for program evaluation, and anticipate and deal with common practice evaluation problems. This chapter also covers how to facilitate transitions and endings, or what we also call terminations for clients. The chapter also will cover practice, personal reflection, and self-correction regarding termination. The chapter will also help clients resolve problems concerning termination and select appropriate termination strategies for clients. Additionally, the chapter will help generalist social workers understand how to implement prevention interventions to ensure maintenance of change, and also how to engage in follow-up activities with client systems. Evaluating social work practice is considered best practice in social work. In order to understand or know that your practice, style, intervention, or program is working effectively, you need evidence. And evidence is what we consider as best practice in determining whether a practice is effective or not with a particular client or program or system. When we talk about evidence-based practice, it is important that we only use knowledge that has been adequately tested using some degree of scientific rigor. So we want to make sure that we're always informing our thoughts and interventions, as well as our assessments and follow-up, based on best practice. And the only way we know that we're always using best practice is to make sure that we're using informed knowledge and evidence that's already been proven to work with clients. It is also why it's important that as a social work researcher or even a generalist practice social work student, you must always verify and confirm your positions on topics, whether they're assessment topics or intervention topics, with evidence. For this course particularly, it is stressed that you always incorporate the textbook in your writings. It's also important that in this course we talk about incorporating the textbook in your all your assignments, including your discussion boards and your written paper. As you see, the quizzes for this course also includes, or the expectations include that you know the content of the course. The reason why this is stressed is because it speaks to evidence-based practice. If you're writing about a topic of interest, that being a community assessment paper, an agency paper, or any topic in terms of this course and any course, even in the work world, in your practice, you have to show that your approach is grounded in the literature. That's why it is very important that you cite evidence as much as possible. Evidence takes different forms. Evidence can be literature in terms of textbook, your required textbook for class. Evidence can also be peer-reviewed journal articles, websites, if they're reputable, such as the NIH, the Census Bureau, are all considered evidence-based sources. And there are many more. But in order for you to practice as a social worker, be an educator, or be educated in schools of social work, you have to show that your assignments, your thoughts, everything that you do is grounded in evidence. Please, again, it cannot be reinforced enough that evidence-based practice is gold standard across the board, not just for the social work discipline. So it's important that you demonstrate at all times that your thoughts, your opinions related to assessments, interventions, and follow-up is always grounded in the literature. That's how you know it's evidence-based. What do we think about when we think about definitions and purposes of evaluation? When we're talking about evaluation of practice, the textbooks define it as a process of determining whether a given change effort was worthwhile. More importantly, if the outcome was effective. Were the goals met that were set out in the treatment plan, but informed by the assessment? When we're talking about the micro level practice evaluation, we want to know whether a specific intervention with the client was successful. We want to know whether the intervention goals were achieved, as well as how satisfied the client was with services. When we observe evaluations or get feedback from our evaluation, we know whether it speaks to our competency level as social work practitioners. When we talk about your competence, we're talking about your ability to apply theory and methods to your work with clients and how effective that was. We're also wanting to know how our perspective related to clients, whether those observed perspectives were actually accurate or not in our work with clients. And the only way we know how to do that is if we evaluate our work. Another important key feature related to evaluation is that we want to know that evaluations usually seek to explain why a particular outcome occurred. So we want to know not only if our work with clients are effective, but if the interventions that we use, if the expected outcome from those interventions were actually achieved with a client. So evaluations focus on the process and specifically determining how we got to where what we achieved with our client and how we got there. When we're thinking about macro practice evaluation, we want to make sure or understand whether the program specifically accomplished its purpose. When we're talking about macro practice evaluation, we also want to know whether the cost provided to the program was sufficient in achieving its overall goal. So again, we want to make sure that the program accomplished its goals, and we also want to get a good sense of whether the cost that is involved in running the program is worthwhile in achieving its goals. And that we mean whether we need more funding in order to reach goals, or if the funding that we currently have is adequate in achieving the goals of the program. Most program evaluations have a clear purpose at each level in generalist practice, whether we're talking about the macro practice level or the micro practice level. When we think about our NASW Code of Ethics, it's very important that we understand that practice evaluation is part of our Code of Ethics. And there's plenty of ways in which we execute program evaluations. We always want to know as social work practitioners whether we are the practice that we are providing is ethical. And the only way to know that our practice is ethical is if we know that we're working within our competencies, and evaluations help us determine that. We always want to improve our effectiveness with clients, and the only way we can do that is with evaluation. We also want to be aware at all times what our skill level and our knowledge base is for practice, and we also want to continue to improve upon that. And oftentimes evaluations let us know if there are areas in terms of our skills or areas in terms of our knowledge in which we need to improve. So evaluations help improve our skills. It also helps improve our knowledge base because sometimes it may point to areas in which we need to improve in terms of skills or knowledge. When we think about practice evaluation or evaluating programs, we're all also looking at external factors for evaluations as well as those obstacles to evaluations. When you think about external factors in evaluations, you have to understand that most programs are run through some source of funding. And through those funders, we have to prove that the program is actually accomplishing the goals in which it is set out to accomplish. Um, Most agencies have some kind of evaluation process in place. But what we find is that most of those evaluation process tend to only measure the output, um, basically identifying how many clients that agency served, what services were provided to that those particular clients within that agency. How effective was those services are not oftentimes measured, but most agencies have some kind of reporting mechanism in which they're evaluating what they're doing for their clients or their stakeholders in which they're serving. And oftentimes, for funding purposes specifically, it's important to be clear when you're evaluating the program if the agency accomplished its purposes, its particular purpose or purposes, and whether that agency was successful in helping clients. Oftentimes, these programs need to make sure that not only that it met its goals for clients, but also to make sure they use the funding appropriately to meet its goals for clients. It's sometimes hard to justify the ongoing services of a program without being able to measure or evaluate that the program was indeed effective for clients. Oftentimes, in certain political climates, it's hard to get funding approved, especially for social service programs. Most programs can succeed political change if they can justify that the services that they provide met the goal of the agency, and more importantly, if the funds that were provided to the agency indeed met the goal. Most social service agencies are accountable to clients. They're also accountable to funding bodies. They're also accountable to the community, as well as management, leadership, and the board of directors. And because we know this, it's important that we ongoing and routinely engaged in program evaluation. And it's also important that through those evaluations, we're able to articulate what it is we do for our clients and the community and our funders, how we do it, and how our work meets professional standards and competence. And this can only be done through evaluation of our work. Now that we are getting a better idea of how important it is to evaluate your work, you must also understand that there are some obstacles to evaluating your work as well. Usually, practice evaluation is not necessarily a concern for all social workers. Matter of fact, many social workers fear practice evaluations because they feel that it may leave them vulnerable. It may highlight areas in which they're not competent, and you never feel good about knowing that you may not be serving clients effectively. The issue is not really to focus on the outcomes of the evaluation, but to incorporate the outcomes of your evaluation into your work with clients to show that you're improving your effectiveness over time. So again, most social workers fear program evaluations or practice evaluations because they fear that it may highlight vulnerabilities in their work with clients. But what they fail to realize is that by highlighting those vulnerabilities, they're able to improve and show better effectiveness over time for their program, and that is most important. So the fear of social workers related to practice and program evaluation serves as one of the obstacles to the process itself. Another obstacle to evaluation is a lack of routine system evaluation for social workers in terms of their practice, and oftentimes a lack of a routine system evaluation for the program itself. As many of you are in internships, you can see how oftentimes those systems and that workflow is very busy. And oftentimes, because social workers and management and leaderships are so busy working with clients, oftentimes they do not have the time to set up or develop a formalized evaluation process. And that can serve as the obstacle Because if you're not setting up an evaluation process that's formal, you risk the chance of it not being routinely practiced or programs not being routinely evaluated. You risk the chance of those evaluations being mediocre or not really providing you with enough input, data, and feedback in which to improve practice. Another obstacle that comes to a program or practice evaluation is lack of importance of it from the agency level. So some agencies have their own culture embedded, and depending on the leadership of that agency, program or practice evaluations may be a priority, and for some social agencies, it's not. If you are ever working or doing internship at an agency that does not highlight the importance of program evaluation, that can serve as an obstacle to actually having it done. How are you able to evaluate what you're doing with clients if there's no program evaluation or formal program evaluation process in place? How is the program measuring how well it's doing with clients if there's no formal evaluation in place? And again, that may also speak to one of the crucial obstacles, which is lack of prioritization of the evaluation process and practice. Another key area that can serve as an obstacle to evaluation is training of social workers to do formal program or practice evaluations. Many agencies do not engage in formal evaluation processes because they lack the social workers or staff that are able to that are properly trained in order to execute these type of evaluations. And again, it serves as a major obstacles to evaluations in general. So, as a way to sum up the importance of evaluations, we have to understand that there are two major emphases when we're talking about program evaluation. We're measuring effort and we're also measuring effects. When we talk about effort, we're talking about ability to assess the outcomes of a program or an intervention. I'm sorry. When we're talking about the effort, we're talking about the ongoing process of how the agency assesses the outcome. And when we're talking about the effects, we want to know how the outcomes of a program or an intervention is being met. The ultimate goal is always to measure the effectiveness of the service that is being provided. And the ultimate goal is always to generate information that increases the effectiveness of intervention. And we also want to know the effectiveness of how what we are doing as social workers, how it's being accomplished with clients, and to what magnitude it's being accomplished with clients. And we also want to make sure, in terms of being efficient, that the cost that is being provided through our funding to run the program is indeed adequate to meet the effects of the outcomes that we're looking for. So we will always want to make sure that when we're evaluating, that we're looking at the efforts and we're looking at the outcomes, we're looking at performance, and we're looking at efficiency. All those things are important when we're talking about evaluations of practice and evaluations of programs. In more detail, when you're thinking about practice evaluation, you want to know which techniques you use with a client that seem to be most useful or helpful in a given situation. Some agencies have different interventions that they use. You may want to measure which one is most useful to clients under which circumstances. This helps you decide which interventions you want to maybe continue to use in the future, or which interventions you may want to omit in the future. And you also want to get an idea when you are doing your evaluation of the agency, whether you're measuring the efforts and or the activities on behalf of your client, or you are measuring the outcomes of those efforts and activities on your clients. Sometimes evaluations want to evaluate the adequacy of your performance. It also may be interested in the efficiency of your performance. And so we need to always understand that there's many facets to evaluation, and it basically determines what type of data that you want to gather from that evaluation and in what areas you may be trying to improve based on that evaluation. And so when we talk about the evaluation process, there are different types of evaluations. There are formative evaluations, summative evaluations. There's a baseline perspective, validity, and reliability. When we talk about formative evaluations, we are assessing the adequacy or the amount of effort directed at solving a client system problem and gathering data during the actual intervention. Formative evaluations focus on the process of providing help instead of on the end product of that help. Summative evaluations tend to be a process that occurs during a wrap-up period, such as an end of semester exam, an end of semester course, and they serve to help you determine whether or not you have learned the material outlined in the course objective. For this program, in most social work programs, you will get an evaluation at the end or toward the end of the semester asking you whether you felt that you've learned the objectives set forth in that course, how well you feel that you've learned the reading, not just by evidence of your grade, but basically how you felt you engaged with the material and whether you competently understood the knowledge and the skills necessary for that particular course. And so when you think about your end of year or end of semester course evaluation, that will be a good example of what a summative evaluation is. Formative evaluations occur while a plan change process is continuing and or oriented toward the future. The goal is to affect or influence what is yet to come. Summative evaluations, on the other hand, occur at the conclusion of the plan change process. So again, formative evaluations occur during the change process, and the summative evaluations occur at the conclusion of the plan change process. So if you're in your agency and you are trying to determine whether an intervention that you're working with a client is indeed serving its purpose, you may want to do a formative evaluation to know in real time whether the intervention that you're providing is effective. For a course evaluation, a summative evaluation at the end may serve more helpful because you want to know toward the end that the students learn the material. Summative evaluations can have elements of formative evaluations in that oftentimes instructors will take information from the summative evaluations and apply it to the next semester. That is, that most instructors will take the feedback that students provide from one semester and translate that into the next. So it may not be as helpful for the current cohort of students, but it may benefit the cohort of students moving forward. However, this would determine whether the feedback that's provided to the instructor is valid and reliable. Meaning, is it really going to improve the outcomes for the next student cohort? So as a recap, formative evaluations are normally occurring during the change process itself because it's informing the process as you're moving along. And a summative evaluation tends to do a reflective summary of how an intervention, a practice, a course, or a program met its achieved goals and or competencies. Baseline is also a similar and key concept when we talk about evaluation of process. Baseline is a measure of the frequency, intensity, or duration of a behavior. Again, baseline is a measure of the frequency, intensity, or duration of a behavior. And it is important in assessing the progress of some helping relationships. Before we can ever know whether a practice intervention or behavior or a change is has changed over a course of time, we have to be able to document and measure some type of baseline. That's a pre-intervention stage. Ideally, a baseline should be based on several observations, not just one. And these observations should also always be made over a period of time, and they also must occur before the intervention occurs. So that the importance of a baseline is making sure that the process and the essentials for conducting that process is evaluated. So again, a baseline is not just used in evaluation in terms of programs or practice, but you will also learn when you move along in the sequence to talk about research. Baseline is also an important concept for that. So again, in order to know whether an intervention or a practice has changed over time and with frequent observations, you need to be able to capture or measure the behavior the behavior that you're trying to modify prior to the intervention. And that baseline data is that behavior or phenomenon that was occurring before the intervention. And then after the intervention, you then go back and compare the outcomes with the baseline in order to determine if the practice and or the program was effective in that particular instance. Validity refers to the extent to which an instrument measures what it is supposed to measure. When we're evaluating a practice situation, it is important that we measure, we use appropriate measures. And the only way to know if the outcome or the instrument that we're using is measuring what it's supposed to measure and or its validity is if we engage in ongoing practice evaluation of a specific practice situation. So again, validity refers to the extent to which an instrument measures what it is supposed to be measuring. When we're talking about instrument, think about the different type of instruments that you use in your internships or your agencies to measure the outcomes for clients. Or instruments can be assessment tools as well. For an example, there may be an anxiety screen or an anxiety evaluation that your agency use. There are definitely evidence-based depression scales such as the Beck Depression Scale or the Edinburgh Postpartum Depression Screen. All those are considered valid and reliable instruments. And over time, it required rigorous research in order to establish it as evidence-based. And one key area that has to be satisfied is the validity of that instrument. So think about while you're in your internship, what type of instruments that are used to measure outcomes of clients or outcomes for programs and how valid that instrument is. When you identify that instrument that your agency used to measure outcome, determine whether there's face validity with that instrument. And when we talk about face validity, we're talking about whether, in your professional judgment, whether that measure actually measures what it is supposed to measure. Also think about concurrent validity of that instrument, right? When we talk about concurrent validity, we're talking about how that instrument is scored and how that score correlates with other instruments that is already considered valid. As an example that I provided earlier, the Beck Depression Screen is considered a very valid and reliable instrument, and it does have a validity score attached to it. You'll learn more in your research courses about that. But you want to then take that validity score for that particular depression screen that is used in your agency and potentially correlate it with the Beck. So if you know that Beck has a high validity score, you want to see how high the validity score is for the instrument in your agency as compared to the Beck Depression Screen. And that is what we consider concurrent validity. There's also another concept that the book talks about, which is your predictive validity. And predictive validity establishes the ability of the instrument in predicting future events. So basically, for instance, the Beck Depression instrument, it has high validity. So you should be able to give a score based on the Beck depression, and that score should then be able to tell you whether that particular client or patient is depressed. So you should be able to know that when certain clients or patients are taking that score, a certain score on that measure will determine whether that client is mild, moderately, or severely depressed. And you should be able to tell by that score um, the future outlook in terms of that person's depression based on the score itself. Again, and sometimes that's giving it a more nominal category as moderate, mild, moderate, and severe. So, for instance, a score of 1 to 5 may predict mild depression for that particular client. And through your observations and through self-report, you should be able to predict based on that low depression screen that that client is indeed mildly depressed. If you get a higher score on that screen, such as 10, 10 and up, or higher scores, you should be able to predict that that score reflects moderate depression, and similar for severe depression. And that is what we're talking about when we discuss whether that particular instrument has predictive validity. So again, think about the instruments in your internships that you're measuring and determine whether there's face validity, concurrent validity, and predictive validity. And the final concept I want you to consider when we're talking about the evaluation process and how we go about the evaluation process is reliability. And that is the extent to which an instrument measures the same phenomenon in the same way each time the measure is used. Again, reliability is the extent to which an instrument measures the same phenomenon in the same way each time the measure is used. And again, the key piece here is each time the measure is used, it's considered reliable. There is a relationship between reliability and validity, as you probably can understand based on some of the key definitions for both. But you also need to be aware that an instrument can be reliable but not valid. And the book speaks more into the difference between reliability and validity and how an instrument can be reliable but not valid. There are many type of data gathering methods used in the evaluation process. Some of the commonly used methods that you may have heard of in terms of evaluations include surveys, scores on instruments, interviews with significant others such as parents, teachers, family members, or records or data that you use such as school attendance data. It could be medical charts in hospitals. All those things are different methods that we use to collect data. When we talk about surveys or interviews, they can be considered structured or unstructured. When we talk about a structured interview, we're talking about using a specific set of questions in a very structured format. When we're talking about unstructured interviews, we're talking about using open-ended questions in an informal discussion. Observations may be a direct person-to-person or recorded in some type of way, such as videotaping or audio taping, is another form of data gathering method. Also, self-reports are used, but we also have to understand that sometimes when we use self-report measures, that the data that we are collecting can be very subjective to the person who's providing the data in that self-report. But again, those are some of your more common data gathering tools and methods. Other methods that are also considered subjective in data collection includes depression scales. Sometimes assertiveness schedules and other devices are also considered very subjective. Observational measures as well can be very subjective as they really rely on the lens and the perspective of the person doing the measuring. Especially when you're trying to observe whether there are things such as a change in the client's behavior or that you're observing a specific situation in context with that client. All those type of data gathering methods are considered subjective. Whenever you are relying on a person or another individual who is using their lens to gather the data, you have to account for the fact there's some subjectivity related to that. Key concepts is independent and dependent variable as well as generalizability. When we're talking about the independent variable, it is the factor we think is responsible for causing certain behaviors, reactions, or events. Again, the independent variable is the factor we think is responsible for causing certain behaviors, reactions, or events. You will hear independent variable often in program or practice evaluations, but you'll also hear it a lot in research. The dependent variable is the outcome or the end product of the helping process. The assumption is that the outcome is dependent upon the helping effort. Again, the dependent variable is the outcome or end product of the helping process. The assumption is that the outcome is dependent upon the helping efforts itself. In practice, we know that independent variables or our helping is not totally responsible for the outcome. There may be other intervening variables that exist that may also impact the outcome. The textbook doesn't go into too much detail, but they just want you to know that it is a possibility, and you need to consider that sometimes the outcome may not be the intervention that you're providing, and you need to be cognizant of that in your evaluation. In research, we call that confounding variables, and you'll learn more about that later on in the course sequences. But the main point here is to be aware that sometimes you may think that an outcome is based on your intervention because you may not do enough rigor in your observation and in your considerization or your conceptualization or your methods, that you don't account for other reasons why that outcome may be that may not be related to the intervention itself. And lastly, the concept of generalizability, which is the ability of a set of results in one situation to fit another circumstance or instance. Generalizability is the ability of a set of results in one situation to fit another circumstance or instance. Generalizability is very good when you're considering evaluation. You want to know that the results can be generalized to other programs, or you want to know that the outcomes or the results can be generalized to other clients or patients. So the outcome is important. If you know that a particular tool works or an intervention works, you want to be able to claim that not only does it work, but it works not only with your client, but if applied to other clients or other programs, the same outcomes will be deliverable under those circumstances. And that is a very, very, very strong claim. And that's why it's very important to be able to have some sort of generalizability in your evaluation, or in your outcomes. You want to make sure that they are generalized to other populations, other programs, other clients, etc. Other areas covered in your textbook also talks about single subject design, and it also covers goal attainment scaling. Briefly, single subject designs are research methods aimed to determining whether or not an intervention was successful. And usually we look at the letters A and B, or ABA, where A is the baseline and B is the intervention. And some of them say ABA, where you're looking at the baseline, you're looking at the intervention, and then you're going back and comparing it to the baseline again. And it's usually used with an individual subject or a single case study or a single system, and that's how the name is captured, a single subject design. The book also talks about the steps in implementing the single subject design. It's pretty straightforward. And also talks about a record of the frequency and other type of important information in terms of capturing the research method of single subject design. But for the purpose of this discussion, just know that it is a research method or research design that usually is set up um, to measure whether an intervention is working. And the key to this is measuring one, or A, which is the baseline, and then applying the intervention, which is B. And then oftentimes there's an A, so it's AB, which is baseline, measuring the baseline, doing the intervention, and seeing if there's a change, or A, doing the baseline, B, conducting the intervention, and then A, going back and comparing the results after the intervention with the original baseline data. So that could be considered ABA design. When we talk about goal attainment scaling, it is a method used when achievement of the goal is sufficiently important. So again, goal attainment is a method used when achievement of a goal is sufficiently important, and that goal is used as the primary outcome criteria. So if you're actually determining whether you're trying to measure whether the client met their achieved goals, you will want to use a goal attainment scaling in order as a design in order to determine that. It can be in a goal attainment scaling that it's hard to ascertain whether a goal has been achieved. And even with that, you want to use some way to be able to scale it down to determine whether the goal was met. And so it could be met and utilized in different situations. Oftentimes, goal attainment scaling is used when the outcomes from a single subject design is not sufficient, and you need to determine more in depthly whether a goal has been attained. Similar to goal scaling, we also have task achievement scaling, which is a method of evaluating the degree to which an identified set of tasks has been accomplished. And also client satisfaction questionnaires, which many of you may already be familiar with, which are usually a series of questions designed to learn the reactions of the customer to various aspects of a product. Sometimes doing a evaluation of programs, as stated earlier in this discussion, is to make sure that the program or the intervention is meeting um, the goals that it set out to meet. But the other important piece of an evaluation of an intervention or a practice or a program is to do a needs assessment, right? When we talk about a needs assessment, we are thinking about what is the front end analysis. They are helpful in identifying gaps in services and helping an agency decide whether a need for a service still exists. So we are not oftentimes just doing an evaluation to gather data, but it's also informing us to the potential needs that were met. And this is an exercise that you engaged in with your community needs assessment. When we're talking about different types of assessment, a needs assessment is just one. There's also what we call an evaluability assessment, which is the methods designed primarily to answer the question, can this program be evaluated? Is the agency evaluation ready? So we're talking about evaluability. You need to decide whether it is even possible to do or conduct the level of evaluations that's needed to determine whether the program is doing what it seeks to do or whether the intervention is actually working. Before you can even do that, you need to determine whether that program or intervention is even evaluable. And an evaluability assessment does that. A process analysis is concerned with the number of clients served or the kind of services provided. Most agencies that I know of will engage in some kind of process analysis, even though they may not be engaged in in-depth program or intervention evaluations. Most of them are doing some type of analysis of a process. That can look very different depending on the program. It also is dependent on on how the information is gathered from both the producer and the consumer of the process. That can be the social worker or the client. Another type of analysis is a program outcome analysis. A program outcome analysis is an evaluation designed to tell whether or not a program is working. It may also help us find out if a program is cost effective, that is, if the results merit the expense. These are more specific concepts in the program evaluation process. And specific process, definition of process that we use in specific evaluation designs. Similarly, program monitoring is an ongoing activity designed to provide information to the agency on all aspects of its operation. Data may be collected on presenting problems. Data may be collected either on client demographics or service provided and/or the outcomes achieved. Agencies develop information management systems so that they can routinely assess how various aspects of their programs are progressing. Many agencies are converting to IT processes in order to capture this data either in real time, that programs can be managed and or change can occur sooner rather than later. Continuous quality assurance evaluations are usually focused on measuring attainment of previously identified program goals. The program goals are usually specific indicators that the agency has accepted as evidence of best practices. As with any process, it's important to understand the issues and problems in evaluation. I will talk about them briefly here. Those are problems with generalizability, problems with cultural competence and evaluation, wrong choices of evaluation tools, failure to involve clients in the evaluation process itself, staff distrust of the evaluation, and the evaluation process interference with service provision. I'll talk briefly about a few of these. Sometimes when you're evaluating a practice intervention with a client, you may have an outcome that is specific to that client. And sometimes one of the problems is that we assume that because we have an outcome with one client that it is generalized to other clients, and it may not be the case. And so we need to be aware of getting feedback or getting results from evaluations that we feel may be generalizable, but we did not do the rigor in terms of the ongoing evaluation process to really determine whether it is actually generalized to other clients. Cultural competence and evaluation is also important because it can speak a little bit to that generalizability. Sometimes we think that because we get a certain result with a certain cultural group, that result is generalizable to other cultural groups, and that is not the case. Oftentimes, we also need to make sure that when we're doing evaluations, that we apply concepts of cultural competence to that evaluation. When we're doing evaluations, we want to make sure that the sample sizes that we choose to do the evaluation is reflective of the diversity factors and or characteristics of a particular population. We want to be sensitive in our data gathering approach when we talk about use of research or evaluation with certain cultural groups. We also want to be cognizant of language differences, and proficiency, specifically with English, if that's our primary language. We also want to make sure that from our evaluation standpoint, that we are inclusive of minority groups, people of color, women, people who may identify as LGBTQ. We also need to make sure that when we are using questionnaires, that they are applicable to both genders in our language as well as in the types of questions we're using. We also want to make sure the language that we use is culturally sensitive. We also need to understand or know when we need to utilize the aid of interpreters, and that's a key aspect when we are thinking about cultural competent evaluations. You also want to not overly stress problems, particularly with oppressed, subjugated populations. You want to make sure, though, that you're focusing on strengths to the utmost extent possible. Again, avoid generalizing findings to other groups that may not have been represented in the evaluation or the study itself. You also want to look for differences to help explain differential outcomes. And again, make sure that the questions that you're using are gender neutral and not biased. This also can be developmentally when you're talking about older adults versus younger persons. And all these are key when you're thinking about evaluation tools. One way to help you maintain cultural competence um, in general is to make sure that you include clients, if at all possible, in the evaluation process itself. Have them inform the tools that you use, your measurement tools. Have them inform how you go about the design of conducting the evaluation itself. And by involving clients, that is a strong way to make sure you adhere to cultural competence standards. But it's just also good best practice when you're thinking about the evaluation process itself. You also need to be mindful that depending, as I stated earlier, it might be an agency that does not conduct formal evaluations often, or they do not have staff that are trained, and that may also lead to distrust of the process itself. Fear and or distrust can sabotage an evaluation process because you can't rely that the data that you're getting from the people you're evaluating is informative, valid, or reliable when fear and distrust is present. Also, as stated earlier in this presentation, another reason why the evaluation process um, oftentimes does not occur in a lot of agencies has to do with the busyness of the agency and its interference with service provision. This is not to say that evaluation is not to occur, but sometimes by anticipating the issues and the problems with evaluations, help determine how to account for those things in advance so that you can have a more productive and meaningful evaluation process. And you oftentimes must expect that there are oftentimes unintended consequences of program evaluations and be ready for any unintended consequences or unintended information that may be gathered in the evaluation process. This slide talks a little bit more about unanticipated consequences, but it also talks about other explanation, or as I stated earlier on the slide, confounding variables that you may need to consider when you are looking and analyzing the outcomes of a program or an intervention. Some key concepts you might want to think about is the history of that program or that intervention within that program, how much that program has matured or the use of the intervention has matured over time. You want to look at mortality, which can be use or discontinued use in terms of outcomes of a program. The creaming is another concept that the book goes more into detail about. Regression toward the mean and reactance. All those are alternative explanations of program outcomes. Due to time, I won't go into too much. I won't go into detail with those, but the book does describe them. Termination and follow-up, I want to use the last remaining minutes of this presentation to talk about that. As you're nearing the end of your semester, oftentimes in your field internship, you should be executing some of the termination process and preparing for the follow-up for your clients. Please understand that our NASW Code of Ethics requires or determines ethical practice as the process of terminating and having those critical thinking processes about terminating. Terminating professional relationships are part of our ethical obligation. There are also tasks associated with terminations. And we also have to realize that sometimes terminations are planned and sometimes terminations are unplanned. I think this is a good time to have this discussion as you're getting close to the end of the semester. You may need to work on discussing more diligently what that termination is going to look like for the end of the semester. Termination is the end of the professional social work relationships. All relationships between clients and social workers eventually must end at some point, whether it's due to completion of goals, end of a contract, intern completing their internship responsibilities, an employee relocating to a new job, a client being referred to another program, um, what have you. A termination is inevitable to occur. The worker must prepare the clients and themselves for termination. They must manage the termination process and be mindful of the planned change process as it relates to termination and follow-up. The task of termination and follow-up is similar, whether you're working with individuals, a family or group, a community or an organization. The book outlines the task of termination and it outlines it in about 6 steps. Step one is deciding when to terminate the professional worker client relationship. The key here is whenever that time frame is decided, it should be discussed with the client at the very first contact. So during the intake process, termination should be discussed. And the time frames for termination should also be discussed. You also want to include evaluating achievement of objectives, whatever evaluation you have conducted up until that point. That needs to be discussed during the task of the second part of the second step of the second part of the second part of task determination. The third step is evaluating the services provided by the agency and or the worker. Again, also part of the task of termination. Maintaining and continuing progress, making sure that is clear and established in the termination process. Resolving emotional reactions of the worker and or the client, and making appropriate referrals as possible. As stated, there are plenty of reasons that you terminate, and one is a planned termination, where it is expected that the worker will consider the timing of the termination in that helping relationship. This has to be notified to the client as soon as possible. Again, best practice is at first contact, even if it's just notifying the client that you're a student who will be engaging in a field placement that will be 2 semesters, a fall and spring, with a planned break for the holidays. And also knowing when to terminate is important also with the planned termination process. Unplanned terminations are unfortunate, but they happen as regularly as planned terminations. And there are many reasons why this happens, and this may be because of the control of the social worker, or sometimes it's out of the control of the social worker. And sometimes terminations need to occur because there's no progress being made with that particular client, or the client is regressing in terms of they're not getting better, but they're getting worse. And all these are reasons why there may be an unplanned termination for that client. You have to be mindful that there are going to be reactions related to termination because it's a form of a loss. And you need to be well managed in terms of what your feelings are about the termination and what the client's feelings are, and to account for that in the termination process. We don't want to harm clients with the termination process, so we want to put support systems in place if possible for clients, and by letting them know earlier, as early as possible, and reminding them throughout the course of treatment, this helps prepare them for the planned termination process, or unplanned, because sometimes it happens which is out of your control. And also making sure you know where you sit in terms of your feelings regarding it, and you make sure you're managed and supported properly based on your feelings related to the termination process. When you're thinking about the reactions and feelings of the client as well as yourself, you need to expect that there may be a range of emotional responses. Some of that can be depression, grief, loss, anxiety about the termination. You may want to consider the amount of contact. How often were you seeing that client? Was it monthly? Was it weekly? Was it daily? And that will give you a good sense of how that emotional reaction related to that termination may look like. What is the size and the type of the system in which the termination is occurring? In smaller, more intimate community organizations, losses may be experienced more dramatically than for larger systems where clients don't necessarily get a chance to establish that relationship or connection with the worker because they see a different worker every time they come in contact with the agency. And also there may also be just mixed feelings regarding it. And just as a social worker or a generalist practicing social worker, you must be mindful that there will be a range of mix of feelings that client may experience. And again, be mindful that you will also go through your own emotional reaction, which may be mixed feelings related to the termination process, or it could be um, uh, strong feelings related to that loss. Um, the book talks about positive worker reactions to terminations, and they give ideas and or scenarios in which a positive termination can occur. And it talks about when the terminations are gradual, meaning they occur over time, starting with the very first contact. That tends to evoke a more positive worker reaction to termination. When workers felt a significant degree of control over the termination process, tended to yield more positive worker reactions. When the worker-client relationship was important to both parties, when the change goals have been attained, that also tend to lead to more positive worker reactions. When the worker wanted the termination and when the worker felt that they had control over the termination. Again, all those things yielded better outcome or more positive reactions to the termination process for clients. You are empowered to support the client and yourself with any termination process because it's usually expected, whether it's planned or unplanned, you know at some point it's going to occur, and that way you have some kind of control over how that process may may play out. And it's also important that, if possible, you plan for termination. And even when it's unplanned, you can still plan to notify clients as soon as possible and help them work through those feelings. And it's also important that you make it a point to address all feelings about terminations. That's your feelings as well as the client. And again, just to summarize some key points, be mindful of your reaction and feelings to termination, which can you or the client, and this can be measured by the extent and range of emotional reactions that can occur, amount of contact, size and type of system, mixed feelings, and the worker's reactions related to termination. Making sure that when possible, you plan as much as possible for termination and address the feelings about termination and summarizing process, and focusing on stabilization of change, meaning whatever change that has occurred in your work with that client, putting some kind of plan in place to make sure that that change continues over time. And that can be done in small groups and in large systems. And making sure you address ongoing needs of the client, whether you will be the worker or another worker will be taking over for you, or whether that client is being referred to another agency. And so also that follow-up is key. This is a task. You have to make sure you consult with your agency policy related to follow-up with clients, but you want to make sure if at all possible that you at least do one follow-up with clients just to do a check-in or have talk about your agency about with your agency about having a process of follow-up and overcoming any barriers to following up with clients. And that's key to stabilizing the change that has been reached or the work that has been done with that client over time. And this will conclude the end of our Chapter 8 review.